me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Time flies. We are in the fourth session of Salesforce Flows Learning Series. We started a month ago, and thank you all for joining us for the last 3 sessions and for joining us today as well. First of all, thank you so much for taking time on your Wednesday evening and then joining us for this session. Thanks to the speakers as well, William and Olivier, for taking time on a weekday to come and do this session for us. We know there is a lot of hard work that has gone behind it. We see from the quality of content that you're providing us for the last 3 plus today's session, which I'm looking forward to. Thank you so much for doing this for our community. And we do have a quick announcement and congratulations in order for William and Olivier for their promotion at Slalom. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, you know our speakers already, so I'm not going to have any formal introduction today because I see a lot of people who attended the previous sessions. Instead, if William and Olivier, if you don't mind, can you share some quick fun facts about you or something we don't know about?
About us?
Yes, of course, about you.
Let me see. Well, actually, I don't know if some people on the call would have noticed. I'm based out of Montreal, but I'm not Quebecer. You could have recognized that from my accent. I'm actually from France. So I moved to Montreal 10 years ago. So some people might have heard the difference between myself and Olivier, who's Olivier a Quebecer. So that would be my fun fact.
And I would say it's pretty much on the you put us pretty much on the spot. For me, I would say I'm very bad at direction. Like I'm super direction. Like I cannot find my north or my east, my west. I'm so bad at that. I would say I wasn't able ever to get hold of that.
And I'm sure you're not alone there. I'm pretty much the same way, and I'm sure a lot of people I know struggle too. Thank you so much.
It's going to be a problem in the London subway where all branches, you know, northbound, southbound. So if you do not keep your picture in your head, it's just completely mess.
So, all right, thank you so much for doing that for us. And yeah, a quick thing about your group leaders, myself, Sudha here. Prashant is on the call. Neil couldn't join us today, but if you'd like to connect us, here are our social handles. I will also paste these in the chat so that you can get the quick link to our group so you could collaborate there. Also, the recordings of the session and the presentations will be posted there. The sponsor host of the event today, again, is Slalom. And thank you so much, Slalom, for giving us the Zoom for the entire series. And we're really grateful for your support. Okay, without much ado, let's get on to the session. Today's agenda is going to be focused on Flow advanced concepts and the best practices. And that'll be a wrap-up session for the Flow learning series. Quick housekeeping rules: turn on your camera if appropriate, mute your mic unless you're having a question and you have to speak so that we have a clean recording and everyone can hear what the speakers are talking. Post your questions in the chat. Feel free to engage, ask questions, participate, network. The chat window is always open. And don't forget, be polite and respectful too. All right, over to you, William and Olivier, for the session today.
Cool. Thanks, Soda. Olivier.
Yes, I'll start sharing. Here we go.
All right, so welcome, Sudha said, welcome to our session number 4 and the last session. It went by pretty fast and I hope you guys enjoyed it. So yeah, last session today. Thank you again to the organizers and thank you to the crowd. Thank you for the people who attended that every week. As Prashant said, we've seen some familiar and regular names. And I think that's how you get the most value after the session, because sessions after sessions, we were building on top of what we were seeing in the previous session. It has been really a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun preparing this for you, and we had a lot of fun presenting it and exchange it with you. And the crowd was pretty good and engaged, so it was great. So the agenda for today, as Sada mentioned, we're gonna so first we're gonna go through the exercise that we shared last week for the screen flow. So Olivier will present what is the solution and how you could have tackled that requirement. Then we'll go into some additional flow components and features. Then we'll talk about best practices and flow limits. And there's actually one additional session that I forgot to add here, which we're going to talk a bit more about how to migrate your current automation to flows using some of the provided tools by Salesforce. We're just going to touch on that. And then we'll finish with some Q&A. Today's session will be a bit less demo oriented than the two sessions we had because we wanted to make sure to cover additional concepts and go through as much as possible. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Olivier.
Yes, so I'll start by going over the recap of the screen flow exercise we created yesterday, and then I'll show you an example of how you could resolve it. So the scenario is, in order to improve the response speed of the customer service department, the customer support manager at OW Telco wants the team to gain efficiency when they capture information about customers' problems. In order to do this, he asked the Salesforce department to build the team an interactive form that will allow them to create new cases and relate them to accounts. They will have to fill the following fields: account, if it exists in the org. If it doesn't exist, the rep will have the opportunity to create it from the screen if he wants. Subject, type, origin, priority. The pick list will always have to be in sync with the related pick list in the case object. The reps will need to be able to trigger the form from an account and from their own page. After thinking a bit more about it, the customer support manager also would like the flow to be available everywhere in the org. So we'll go look at the flow, and then we'll go look at how we can distribute it in the org. So I'll jump in the demo org here. So here is how I resolve the flow. I use a different technique than what we did last time on the example we showed you, where we were looking if we had a record ID and adding two different screens. In this one, I'll open the screen there, and you can see that I manage the visibility of my component on the screen. So I can have only one screen and all the information I want here. Basically, I got my same toggle button with the etiquette here. I look here if my record ID is null. If it's null, I show it. If it's not null, I will not show it since the account will already exist. I do the same thing here with those variables here and the toggle button. And as you can see, it's super flexible. We can add multiple conditions to manage the visibility of our screen. I have my subject and my case type. There was one thing in the exercise where I said that we want to have the pick list value always in sync with the case. And how we can do that is by using a pick list choice set. When you go here, for example, if you create a new pick list choice set just for the demo here purpose, you go here because it's a choice resource, and you can select the object you want. Let's say, for example, this one was case. And then I say I want to have all the pick list, and it will make all the pick lists available that are in the case object. This way, whenever you change the case, the value of a pick list, it will be modified on the case object here. Same thing for origin and priority. Then in our scenario, we had a decision to take. For example, we had to check, is our record ID null? If it is not null, we'll do an action. If we have something in the account name field, we'll do something else. And then if there's a lookup field then we'll do something else. The first one was just populating the account ID, a text variable here with the value of the record ID. Here we were creating the account and assigning the value to account ID. And on the other one, we were assigning the ID of the lookup to the text field. And from there, we just had to do a quick create here to create our case. Very simple. From there, the distribution of the case needs to happen. So the first one, we wanted to have it in our home page. So if we go to home page, we will see that we have the full screen here. We could have input anything we want with the pick list that interested us. And then let's see if we have it from the account, we can see that it's the same flow, but I have less component here. As you can see, if I edit my page, you'll see that I can pass a value, all the value of the case to my record ID variable, as you'll see in a second. Those Lightning record page always are a bit slow to load. If you go there, you can see that because I have a record variable here, I can click this and it will pre-fill all the value of my case, of my account in my flow. So I'll have the record ID value available for you to work with without having to do a get from it. So that was the resolution of the case, of the exercise. And there's multiple ways to achieve it. Like this one was one way, but there's many other ways you could have rearranged your blocks or your action to make it work. So then I'll jump back in the PowerPoint and we'll go look at the different flow component that can be added that are stuff more advanced, but that can be super helpful in the future. Our first thing are Apex action. Apex action are when you want to combine Apex with a flow. For example, you'll create a class and you'll add the notation at invocable method. This will allows you to use your Apex code in a flow. For example, we use it a lot when you want to do a select in a list. So get a list of lists, for example. Or if we want, let's say, use for a JSON parser, or there's many ways to use it. And how do I use those Apex action? It's an element. So basically, you pick interaction Apex action, and then you select the name you give to your class, and then you can pass any input variable you want to add. We'll in the next slide, we'll go on how do we add those specific variables. And we have those Apex defined data variable. Those data type are super flexible data type that you will create in Apex. It's a different class that allows us to import to handle different lists. For example, like a complex set of variables, a JSON from a web call, for example, and they need to have the Aura enable tag, and you can call them by when you create a resource by using the Apex define here, and having at Aura enable will allow you to have the specific account here. Obviously, you need to have a base in Apex to use those things, but using Apex define variable and Apex action pretty much gives you all the resources you want then to build anything with flows from there. And since it's pretty complex, we also added in the PowerPoint a link to the Salesforce documentation, and this way you can even look a bit more into it. Then we have external flow action. So in the past, you could, and you can still use it, you can use Apex to build integration between system. But now, if your system has the name can be connected properly to Salesforce using external services, you can connect it using external services, and then using external flow action, you can use those call out in Salesforce without having to write any Apex. For example, in a project we were doing, we did all the integration with a payment processor. Let's say the payment processor was ADN using code and point-to-point integration with HTTP callout and everything. But we could also have used flow integration and connecting to the two systems, and then using the Apex action available for us to do any call to request in the system. This is super useful, and if the API is available, you can do all those calls there. Then this leads me to error handling. So error handling is super important in flows. The easiest way I would say is using when you do screen flow. And when you do error handling, like a flow will never be always bulletproof, I would say. If you do any action on the database, create, update, delete, or even like a correction you call code from VS Code, for example, it can fail. Anything in the org can make it fail. And Salesforce will give you a default, I would say, error. And that doesn't mean much here. It will also send you an email with the flow that failed. This is very helpful to troubleshoot. And you can also add what we can think of error handling. If we had a fault path in a flow, the fault path will allow you to, I would say, add a custom message or add custom text or get, I would say, do an action whenever the ML action failed, for example. It can do any behavior and allows you to have, I would say, a clearer, clearer action or a clearer error message whenever a flow failed. For example, your fault path can be used, as I said, to customize any error message. Do a different thing whenever a component of a fail, for example, display a screen or anything like that, and or launch a platform event. And Salesforce even gives you a default platform event that's called a flow execution error event. And this is, I would say, all handled by Salesforce, and you can build the error handling architecture just by using those fault path and this platform event, for example. And then you can also combine those fault path to a rollback action, for example. Whenever you want to add a fault path, you'll click on an object and you'll be able to click add fault path. It's a very visible action there. And let's say for in here, I want to create a new lead. Let's say I create a lead, it works well, and I create an appointment. And if the appointment fails, I want it to be rolled back and not affect my org. I use a rollback action, and then I show again the screen so the user can modify what he entered, for example. This will allows you to prevent any duplicate creation of leads, for example, or appointment. Once we have fault path, good thing are also debug. Whenever you create a flow, you probably experience it if you did the exercise or if you played with flow back in the past. You cannot create a flow without kind of testing it or having debug details on how everything is happening, because you'll see that you won't be able to have, I would say, a flow that works properly. The Flow Explorer gives you what they call a debug logs. And when you click debug flow, you have I would say, an improved debug log when you use trigger record flow, but you can also use the debug log with, I would say, standard feature on any other type of flows. Whenever you trigger your flow to see what's happening, you'll see the debug details here. The debug details, they'll show you what happened at every block of your flow, and you'll be able to see how the limits evolve. For example, how many DML you're doing, where it failed in the flow, and what type of error did it created in the org. And one very important note that I sometimes forget, if you debug a flow without choosing to run the flow in rollback mode, the flow will perform the action in the org. So that doesn't really matter if you're in a sandbox, but if you're running to check a debug in production, for example, that's a bit dangerous. So you need to be very careful. There's also a way to look at failed and paused flow. Let's say you have lots of paused flow in your org. If you go in setup and you look at pause and failed flow interview, you'll be able to see all the pause interview flow interview in your org and see if they are still needed to be paused, or if you can, I would say, interact with them and close them, for example. But you can also see all the failed flow interview, and those failed flow interview will tell you a lot of how the flow is behaving. Either it's a flow that runs like as a record trigger flow, but also if you run it as a screen flow, for example, or with a button as an auto launch flow, for example, you'll be able to see where the flow failed and why did it fail. If you use a platform event trigger flow though, and it failed, you won't know, you won't be able to see it in the failed flow interview record residue. So it's I would say a benefit of all the flow except platform event flow. There's also a new feature that Salesforce gave us, and it's called test. How you can, like, it's very similar to what you do when you build an Apex test class, but it's a bit more flexible than the debug log in a way that it allows you to pre-create some tests. So you can see if whenever you modify a big flow, for example, you can still run your test and assert that it works well. It's still in beta, so it's getting better and better, but it's very well made and allows for some easy and quick testing of your flow. So this is a pretty good new feature that Salesforce is bringing us. And this is pretty much everything that we were talking about all the additional feature that Salesforce added for us. Now I can pass it on to William, so he can tell you the different best practice and limitation of flow.
Thanks, Olivier. So let's talk about best practices and some flow limits. So some of you will have potentially recognized that famous quote from Spider-Man, at least that's how I recall it. With great power comes great responsibility. And someone mentioned at the beginning of the call, even before the session started, that flow is a great tool and it's a powerful tool and you can do a lot of things with it. And that's true. That's true. Like, flow is a tool that allows to bridge the gap between the admin and the devs. It empowers a lot the admins to do more, but it also introduces a lot more risk for errors and performance degradation than with the other automation tool that we had in the past. So that's why it's important to know some ground rule and best practices to avoid breaking the system and degrading the performance. So always be careful when you're building flows. So before going into the details of what are some of those best practices and limits, it's important to understand some terminology. And we're going to keep it short for today in terms of terminology, just 2 items to understand. The first one is multi-tenancy. Some of you might know what this is already. And Salesforce actually operates on a form of software multi-tenancy. So multi-tenancy basically means that a single instance of software, in this case, Salesforce here, runs on a server that is able to serve multiple users, that is shared across multiple users. So if we translate that to Salesforce, what that means is that one instance org, so your production instance of Salesforce, is running on a server that is going to be shared by other customers. And you don't know that, you're not aware of that, because each org is isolated from the other, but they are running on the same server, they are sharing the same resources, the same CPU, and things like that. So an analogy is what we have on the screen here on a building. So let's say that you live on a specific apartment on a building. As we can see, you have your dedicated space, but on that building, a lot of things are shared. You have the power that is shared, the water, and the building maintenance. So that's the same concept in Salesforce. You all live in the same building. Your guys are all on the same server, and you have your specific spot on that server. One of the important things with multi-tenancy and one of the concerns is performance. Because what if someone is monopolizing all the resources? So let's say in the building, what if someone is taking all the hot water? Then all the other peoples are not going to have hot water. So it's important to share properly the resources so that the performance is not degraded for other people using the same server. And so that's where governor limits comes into play. Governor limits are basically a set of limits and rules to ensure that the automation that each and everyone is doing on their own instance is not going to monopolize the shared resources that you have on the server, so that you guys are not taking all the resources and another customer running on the same server is going to be impacted by that. So it's basically a frame for you to say you can build your automation as long as you fall under those specific rules. So if you go to the next slide, please, Olivier. So here I've simplified it, but there are different types of governor limits, and you can explore the link to understand the different limits that you have. What I wanted to highlight today is just that in the context of flows, the governor limits that are going to be important are the per transaction limits. So those are the ones that you want to be really careful when you're developing a flow. And the most common and important limits are what we see on the screen here. So total number of SOQL queries issued equal 100. What this means when we say SOQL queries, if you recall our past session, SOQL queries is the equivalent of when you're doing a get record in a flow, when you're using the get element to be able to get a set of records matching a specific conditions. This is the equivalent of an SOQL query. And within one transaction, within one flow, you can have only up to 100. If you have more than that, your flow is going to fail. The second one is total number of records retrieved by your SOQL queries. So if you have a get element in your flow that is returning more than 50,000 records, then you're above the limit and you're going to hit the governor limit as well. So it's important that as you're using your get element to be able that you're not going to have more than 50,000 records returned, and that's important to specify specific filters in your get elements. Total number of DML statements issues equal 150. What this means when we say DML statements is the equivalent of data elements, so create, update, delete records. You cannot have more than 150 of those within one flow, otherwise it's going to fail. And lastly, the total number of records processed as a result of a DML statement. So when you're, let's say, doing a DML statement like a create record, update record, you want to make sure that within your flow execution, you're not going to insert or update more than 10,000 records. So those are limits that are important to keep in mind as you're building your flow, because if you're not ensuring that your flow is not going to meet those limits, then you're going to have a governor limit error and your flow is going to fail and it's not going to work. And you'll see that pretty explicitly in the error message saying you cannot have more than 100 queries, for example. So if we go to the next slide, let's talk about flow bulkification. And if you're familiar with coding and Apex coding, you've probably heard what is bulkification. That's usually something that was meant more for developer or that developer had to know or worry about before. With flows, that's important that you guys know what this is doing, even though there's not much for you to do, you'll see that flow is taking care of that for you. So bulkification is just a way of designing code to do similar action in one batch, instead of doing multiple action. Bulkification is a way to avoid, to help avoid governor limits. So an example of that is instead of doing 50 create records, one after the other, what you could do is, and instead of having 50 operations to create 50 different records, you would have one create record with a collection of 50 records, and then you would bulkify that into one DML statement, one create element that would create those 50 records at a time. That's what we call bulkification. So the good thing, as I mentioned, is that with flows, if you go back to the previous slide, Olivier, please. The good thing is that with flows, you don't have to worry about that because the interviews are going to be bulkified for you automatically. So there's nothing to do, nothing to action upon, but it's an important concept to understand, to know how it's working, but also to be able to understand when you have a specific errors, why the flow behaved the way it behaved. And we're going to cover that in a sec. So if you go back to the previous slide and the following ones are really, there are specific elements that can be bulkified. It's not all elements. Mainly, it's going to be the elements that we saw that are relevant in the governor limits. So the DML statements, such as create, update, delete records, some of the action that are provided by the flow, like post to chatter, submit for approval. SOQL query are going to be bulkified as well. So get element records, for example, can be bulkified. Instead of doing 3 different get elements, you can do 1. Update, delete element as well. So that is important to know that whenever you're doing an update and you specify some conditions to identify which record you want to update, this is also doing, in addition of the DML to update the record, this is also doing a query, SOQL query, to identify which record you want to update. So that's why you can see under that SOQL query element, update and delete. And then you have all the send emails element that can be bulkified as well. So if you go to the next slide, we have an example to illustrate how bulkification works. And in the example that we have here, it's basically, we have the example that for 100 case that would be updated or loaded through the data loader, what would happen? So what would happen, and actually before that, let me describe the scenario that we have here. So in that flow, the first step that we have is we're going to look at the account on some cases, the parent account on cases, and we're going to try to see how many cases we have associated to that account. Then we have the decision element. The decision element is going to basically determine how many cases are assigned to this account. And then based on the number of cases, if it's more than 5, then we're going to find the account manager, the division manager, and then we're going to notify the account owner. If it's less than 5, then we're going to notify directly the account owner without necessarily needing to notify the division manager. So that's the context for the flow and what it's doing. Now, if we take the example of loading or updating 100 cases, what's going to happen in and the variables for this scenario is that 70 cases have more account have more than 5 open cases, and 30 cases have less than 5 open cases. So if you update 100 cases with the data loader, what's going to happen is that the first interview is going to be triggered. So the first flow interview is going to be triggered, and it's going to execute the first query. So it's going to go to the first element, and it's going to say, this is an SOQL query. As we've seen in the previous slide, this is an element that can be bulkified. What this means is that the interview is going to stop there. It's going to execute the second one on the 100 of interviews that we have. And it's going to say, I'm at a get element, I'm at a SOQL query. I'm going to wait for the next one. And with that, it's going to execute only one SOQL queries for all the 100 interviews that are going to run. After that, once the SOQL query has been done, it's going to go to the second element for the first flows interview, and it's going to look at the number of cases. In our first example, let's say that the first flow interview has the account associated to that has more than 5. It's going to go to the 3A element, find division manager. And it's going to stop there because, again, this is an element that can be bulkified. Then it's going to go to the second flow interview. And the second flow interview is going to say how many cases. And in this case, maybe for that second flow interview, it's going to have less than 5. So it's going to go to the 5 or fewer path. And it's going to go to the notify account owner. Again, this is a core action. This is a post to chatter. So it's going to wait here. It's going to say, wait until you have done all your 100 flow interviews. And at the end, when all the 100 flow interviews have been processed, it's going to say, okay, we have 70 cases that are that have more than 5 open cases. So 70 cases for which we need to do the find division manager, and 30 cases for which we need to do the notify account owner. So instead of 70 queries, it's going to do only one SOQL queries for the 70 interviews. And instead of notifying the account owner 30 times, doing 30 DML, it's going to do only one for the 30. And then when it will go to the next element, notify account owner, same thing, it's going to be bulkified, and it's going to execute that one time. So as a result, instead of having like 100 and actually more than that in terms of elements that are going to be triggered and hitting the governor limits, Flow is intelligently bulkifying this for us, and is just doing 2 SOQL query and 2 DML, even though we're doing that for 100 records. Why is this important to know? If we go to the next slide, in case of errors, so let's say you're doing a data load and for some reason, some of your records are failing. So if some of your flow interviews are failing because there is a governor limit that is being hit, maybe your flow was not properly designed, and after the, I don't know, like let's say the 50 records, there is a governor limit that is being hit because you have done too many queries. What's going to happen is that you're going to have an error, obviously. And as part of the bulkification, the system is going to basically roll back all the changes that were done for the first 50 successful records. So basically, none of the operation is going to be successful. And any operation that was done to an external database, those are not rolled back. But all the other successful operations are going to be rolled back. The second scenario is as you were doing a data load, you had an error that is not related to a governor limit. What's important to know is that Salesforce is going to try to save the successful record changes and it's going to do that up to 3 times. And that is available for the create records, update record, and subflow. So that is just to know if you have an error as you were doing a data load and you're wondering why some records have been successfully inserted even though you have an error. This would be the reason why. This is the bulkification plus the error handling behavior. So if we go to the next slide, some flow limits and consideration. So I'm not going to go through the full table, but there are some limits on flows that are important to know. And I think the most important one is the second row that we have here, executed elements at runtime per flow. 2000. What this means is that on one execution of a flow, you can only execute up to 2000 elements. An element is, let's say, a get records, a decision element, an assignment, a create records. You can only have 2000 of those. If your flow is executing more than that, you'll get an error because it's hitting a limit. So it's important to design your flow properly to ensure that no more than 2000 elements are going to be executed. The other limits, I'll let you explore through that. You have a maximum number of versions, and the limits can vary from an addition to the other. But again, the most important one would be the second row as you're building your flows. So to kind of recap all of that, and if there is one thing that you need to remember from that session, this is this list of do's and don'ts that we've made. So we have 10 items that are really important as you're building flows to know of what to do and what not to do. They're not necessarily sorted by order, but I would say this first one is really the most important one. Don't perform DML operations or SOQL in a loop. So can be data elements, Apex action, core actions. And the main reason for that is what we've just seen in the previous slides, governor limits. As we've seen, you can only execute 100 queries, 150 DML statements. In the first example, in the don't, as you can see, we're basically getting some cases, and then we're just looping through those cases. And in that loop, every time we're going through a case, we're updating the case priority. What this means is that if you have more than 150 cases that are returned by the get cases, your flow is going to fail. Why? Because the governor limit in terms of DML is 150. So you shouldn't do that. Instead, what you should do is remove all the data elements from your loop and put them after your loop. And to do that, you just need to go through the loop and instead do variable assignment. So what you would do is that in a first assignment, you would set your case priority. So you would put your priority to high, but here you're not committing anything. So it's not going to be an issue. And then you're adding that case to a collection. And then once you've looped over all the cases, then you're going to update the cases, but you're going to update, instead of doing it one by one, you're going to update a collection of cases. And it doesn't matter if it's like 200 cases, you're just going to do one DML statement. So that way you're going to avoid the governor limits. And it's the same thing for get element as well. You don't want to put a get element within a for loop because again, if you do that more than 100 times, you're going to hit the governor limits. So if you go to the next slide, the second advice is to never hard code IDs for things like owner IDs, queues IDs, group or record types. Sometimes there will be some exceptions, but most of the time you should never hard code record IDs. And you might be wondering, well, how can I do that for record type? That's something we wanted to show you in the previous sessions, but we have not been able to do so. So this example illustrates that really well. When you're going to create a record of a specific object that has record types, you need to specify the ID of the record type, right? So in your create element, you're going to need to say record type ID equals something specific. And you could say, well, I'm going to just type the ID, copy, paste it, and that way it's going to be fine. That's not a best practice. Instead, what you should do is get the record type ID in a dynamic manner. So to do that, you're going to use the get records, and you're going to do your get on an object called record type. That might be surprising, but there's such an object as record type, and you just need to specify what is the name of your record type. So here you can say object record type. My developer name would be business, and that is going to return the ID of your record type or the record of your record type. And then in your create account, instead of hard coding the ID, you're going to use the value of your get element of what was returned as your get element and just input the ID. That way, doesn't matter if you are in an environment and you move to the other, the ID is going to always be dynamically retrieved and dynamically used and put in the account creation. So the third item would be add entry conditions to your flow. That's something we mentioned during the record triggered session. It's going to be really important as much as possible to try to add entry conditions in the start element and not in the flow itself. So this is an example. I hope no one would do that, but this is an example to illustrate. In the first screenshot, basically your flow would enter every time because you don't have any condition in the start element, and you would have a decision element that say, do I need to execute the flow or not? And then if you don't need to execute the flow, you would go to the no path and nothing would happen. That will work, but that is not the most performant way of doing this, because as soon as your flow enters, it's taking up some performance and it's consuming some performance. So instead, what you should do is add your condition within the start element to make sure that your flow is not entering and executing for nothing. Even if it's just one element, it's still taking up some performance. The next one is limit the amount of flow elements by trying to merge them. And I got this example from someone's comment last week in the session. So again, we saw that there is a limit in terms of the number of elements that can be executed, and that limit is 2000. So the example that we have in the dump works perfectly from a functional standpoint. It works and it's going to do the exact same thing as the other example. It's just that instead of one decision element, we're using two in that first screenshot, and we increase the chance of hitting that limit. So here the example is case priority high? Yes, no. And if it's no, then we're again checking, is then the case priority low? And it can be yes, no. Well, instead of doing that, you can just have one decision element and add the required path, such as, is the priority low? Then it would take the low path. Is the priority high? Then it would take the high path. And that way you just have one decision element. If we go to the next slide, we have another example to illustrate that with DML as well, because you want to make sure that you're not hitting the governor limit. So in that example, instead of doing two update, where in the first screenshot we do set case priority, then we would check a condition. And if the account is a VIP, then we would set the case as a VIP. Well, in that scenario, we would have two DML, which is not performant. So instead of doing that, we could do what we have in the second screenshot, whereas instead of doing the setting the priority right away, we're checking, is the account a VIP? If yes, then we're doing in the same DML, the same update, we're going to set the priority and we're going to set the case as a VIP. So that saves us a DML. And if not, then we're just setting the case priority. So that's a way to limit the amounts of elements. perform DML on collections of records. Again, that's similar to what we've seen in the bulkified. If you have to update multiple records of the same object, even if they're not the same record. So in the example here, we would update an opportunity, and then we would update a parent opportunity. Those are two different records. And you could say, well, I'm going to do two update elements, one to update the opportunity and one to update the parent opportunity. Well, it's not the most efficient way of doing that. Why? You have two DML elements. Instead, what you could do is leveraging the assignment to update the variable, assign the variable, and add those opportunities to a collection of opportunities. So if you look at the screenshot, first we're updating the opportunity priority. Then we're adding this opportunity to our collection of opportunities. Then we're getting the parent opportunities, and we're doing the same thing. We're updating the parent opportunity in the variable, assigning that to the collection, and then we're just updating the collection of opportunities instead of updating the two different opportunities in two different update elements. The next one, add a decision element before performing DML operation. So sometimes in your flows, you're gonna do get. So you're gonna try to get some records, and then you're gonna want to do some update operation or some DML operation. But sometimes, depending on how your flow is designed, your get won't return any records. It's going to be null because maybe there are no records that match your condition. Well, if that happens, you might encounter issues if, for example, you're doing a delete and you try to delete, or the flow try to delete a list of records that is null because you had no records that were returned, you're going to have an error. So your flow is going to fail. So that's important to do a check before doing a DML to make sure that your list or your collection of records on which you want to perform DML is not empty, to avoid errors. And not only to avoid errors, sometimes it's not going to fail. So if you do something different than a delete, if you do a create or an update on an empty list, on an empty collection of records, your flow is not going to fail. It's going to work fine, but it's still going to consider that as one DML statement. It's still going to say, well, I did one DML statement, I did one create record, even though it really didn't update any records. So again, that's not performant, because if you want to be careful about your number of DML statement, again, referring to the governor limits, well, you don't want to waste one DML statement on an empty list of records. So that's why it's important to do that check. The next one, define the trigger order of record triggered flows. Again, that's something we've covered in the record triggered flow session, but it's important to understand how your different flows on the same object are going to be executed and in which order they're going to be executed, right? Because this is something that flow allows us to do, where before we were not able to do that. With Process Builder workflow rule, we had no idea and no control over what was the order in which automation were going to be executed. With flows, that's definitely a plus. And I would encourage you to always define the trigger order so that you know in which sequence your flows are going to be executed, because sometimes you might have conflicting automation and you might not know why. So if you define your order, that's going to be helpful to debug, and that's going to be helpful to build your automation. Next item, and I think last, is limit the number of flows and try to mutualize as much as possible. So in the first session, and this is a question that keep coming and that all the Salesforce community is always debating is, well, should it be one flow to rule them all? Should it be like only one flow where we're going to do everything within that one flow? And someone asked that question during the first session. And the answer we gave is that there is no one magic answer. Sometimes the answer is going to be yes, try to mutualize your flow because they are doing similar things. The logic is not too complex, so your flow is not going to be hard to maintain. Sometimes there are going to be good reasons why you're going to want to have two different flows. And especially with the order of execution, that's not such a big deal. Before, when we had Process Builder, the rule was like you should have only one Process Builder. And the reason for that was that that was your only way to control the sequence in which your automation was going to be executed. With Flow, you can bypass that. But as much as possible, try to mutualize them. So in the example that we have here, we have two different flows. One that is on account creation, which is setting a new flag, and then one that is on account update, which is updating a flag. Well, what you can do instead of having two flows here is merge them into one, which would be on record create and update. And then you could take the logic of those two flows and merge them together. And instead of two, you would have only one that would be on create and on update, and it would be the same. And actually, I noticed that the screenshots here are not accurate. Instead, you should see the same flow, but you get the idea. That is going to be more maintainable, and that's going to be easier to keep the control and understand what is your automation and how it's working. So I think that was the last one for the do's and don'ts. So always refer to that checklist whenever you're building a flow to make sure that you're not doing anything you're not supposed to, or you're following the best practices. Now for the last part, I'm going to quickly touch on migrate to flow, because as we've seen in the first session, Salesforce at some point is going to decommission workflow rules and process builders. So you won't have any choices than to migrate your current automation to flows. And for that, Salesforce has introduced the Migrate to Flow tool, which is there to ease the migration process from your existing automation to flow. Currently, it's only limited to workflow rules. From what I've seen and I've heard, at some point it's going to be extended to process builder, but at the moment it does not support the transition from process builder to flow. To access the tool, you just have to go to the setup, process automation, and then migrate to flow. And actually the tool is pretty well done and pretty self-explanatory. There are some considerations though. So the first one is that you cannot migrate all the workflow rules right now, and not all the workflow rules are supported. You have some specific conditions whenever your workflow rules contain specific elements or is doing specific actions. You cannot migrate those at the moment to flow. So you have for those, you have to do it manually. If the workflow rules contains only fields updates, it's going to convert that to fast field update, which is before safe flow, as we've seen in the record triggered session. This is the more efficient way and the more performant way to do a flow and perform automation if you're only updating fields on the record that triggered the update. So if the flow is for field updates, then the tool is going to migrate that to fast field update. And then the last one, which does the link also with what we've seen in the last do's and don'ts, is reevaluate your workflow rules and corresponding created flow to look at way to merge them, because that the tool is going to do a one-to-one. For each workflow rules, it's going to create a flow. But that's not necessarily the best way of doing that, because maybe some of your workflow rules can be merged into one flow to avoid having, I don't know, 10 or 15 flows. So that's important to look at the flows that were created and try to find ways to merge them and neutralize them. Quick how-to, and again, it's pretty self-explanatory, but when you'll be into that setup option, you just have to, you'll see the list of all the workflow rules that you have in your org, and you just have to select the one that you want to migrate. Click the migrate to flow button, and then you'll have a pop-up that will say, well, this is the flow that has been created. It's in an inactive state. You can test it and you can debug it to see if it behaves properly. And once this is done, you can switch the activation, which is basically going to automatically activate your flow and deactivate your workflows. And after that, you should be done. So you'd have to do that for all your workflows. And with that, I think we're done. So I hope this was useful. I know this was a more advanced concept, so you'll have the documentation. You can always refer to that, but it's important to keep that in mind. So thank you to everyone. And I don't know if you guys have questions. I haven't monitored the chat, but if you have questions, feel free to come off mute.
There are a couple of questions which got answered, but if there's anyone has any open questions, please feel free to unmute and ask the questions.
And it can be on anything. This is our last session, so if you have a question on one of the previous session, feel free to ask them.
got a question for you about Apex, sorry. So maybe you could give an example of like an actual like business case that you dealt with where it went beyond like the declarative like ability and you had to move into programmatic with something like Apex.
Yeah. So one of the example that I can think of,
We can show the Apex list, like when you SQL a list, like
yeah,
shipment in fulfillment order, for example.
this one is a bit technical. We can explain it. So if we keep it simple, I'd say most of the time it can be because you have to do a call out, let's say. So you have to do a call out to an external system. As Olivier mentioned previously, you have two ways of doing that. Either you do an Apex action in which you're going to pass some parameters, and then you're going to do the call out to the external system. So a call out to an external system can be, let's say on a screen flow, I want to be able to check the credit score of that specific person. And there is an external system that is doing that credit score check. Well, you would have used that Apex action to be able to do that call out and then get the answer within the screen flow and then do specific actions based on that answer. For that same use case, you could also use what Olivier showed as the external actions if the integration and the endpoint supports that. Another example, and I think this is what Olivier mentions, and just in general, sometimes flow, you're going to reach some limits in terms of what you can do with flows, or to achieve something specifically, you're going to have to do like crazy complex logic within a flow. So you're going to have to do loops and then loops within a loops, which is not that performant. So sometimes it's best to use Apex action to do things like, let's say you want to query some records that are in a specific list of IDs, right? Well, right now, with the way you can use the get records, you cannot say query all the accounts for which the ID is in that specific list. That's not something you can do with the get accounts. So to do that, what we have done in a previous project is that we have created an Apex action that is receiving as an input the list of IDs. And then with Apex, we are building the query ourselves and we're saying, well, query all the accounts where the name is in that list. And then we're basically returning all that list of accounts. So this is an example on how we use it.
Yeah. This way, like we did this way because we could have done it using a loop and then the get element all the time. But using the Apex action, we'll use one SQL action instead of query, instead of using as many SQL queries as we have item in the initial list. Okay. We also use the Apex action. We received a JSON from another system, and we wanted to use this JSON to execute an action in a flow. And there's a JSON parser that is like super simple to program in Apex, and we wanted to use this action in a flow, so we just used the Apex action that was actually calling the JSON parser function or class in Apex, for example.
That was really helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I know those are questions in the chat. What I hate is the logic that are trying to execute means that in a flow you would need to put a DML within a loop, then you need to go code another logic. Yeah, that's also a good use case. Like if you have no choice than doing a DML within a loop, then you should probably look into Apex code. Even though there are ways to do update bulkified with like collections of records, sometimes you have no choice than to do that through Apex code. How would we be more careful in the dev org as we don't have 100Ks of the record, but in real, there are 100Ks of the records. So is the question like, how would you know that you're going to hit a limit in a sandbox org?
It's just by, I would say, experience.
Yeah, it's experience. And as you're developing your flow, always ask yourself, okay, if I have more than 100 records and I execute, so you can like picture it and I execute the steps of the flow, am I going to hit a limit? Like this for loop can it execute more than 100 times? Do I have an SOQL query within it? If yes, then it means that at some point your flow can break. So it comes with experience, as Olivier mentioned. But yeah, and sometimes you'll just forget about it and you'll hit a limit at some point and you're going to have to rework your flow to bulkify it. So
I guess one of the things here is also to also have a sense of, you may have a current volume of data in your org, but then it will increase, right? So you're building something which should still work year down the line, 2 years down the line. So just keep that also in mind. You may not even get that much data even in your production org, but then it may start creating problems later down the line when someone else is supporting this.
And I think we can let Prashant probably close the session.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just again, a huge thanks to these incredible sessions. I've attended a large number of community sessions. This is really at the top, just from a quality and the value which you guys have brought. I know I'm speaking for everyone who attended, and I know there are a lot of people who requested for the recordings because they were in different time zone, and so you definitely impacted a lot. And just like Ravi was saying in the beginning of the call, he's been creating flows, and I'm sure there are many more out there. So William, Olivier, we can't thank you enough for taking your time out. This is something which obviously you've done yourself. It's a voluntary thing. You've invested your time, and just very grateful for that. So, and just I think seeing that we still have 55 participants on the 4th day when people know their recordings, and just after a long weekend is just a testimony to the popularity of this. And for those who didn't know, the very first session we had about 144 check-ins, which is sort of a record for our admin group, even in the virtual environment. So huge thanks. And I think you guys definitely deserve a lot of love back. So thank you. And yeah, and I do want to open, if anybody wants to also say anything, please feel free. We're just so happy to have William and Olivia.
We have Slalom here, William and Oliver. What are the opportunities to get into Slalom as a Salesforce administrator or developer?
You should probably ping that separately, and they can definitely connect you something there.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You can send us a message on LinkedIn and you can chat about that.
Sure, thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again, William, Oliver, and thank you everyone for joining and turning up every week and really supporting this. And this is something obviously going to be valuable down the line. So just with that, I think we can probably wrap up. I know Sudha had to drop for another call. So I'm just speaking on behalf of the other leads as well and the entire community. Thank you, and hope you all have a great evening and the rest of the day.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye. Thank you.